My name is Charlene Margot, and I am the co-founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Sam Drazin, Executive Director of Changing Perspectives, who will be talking with us about understanding inclusion, ableism, and neurodiversity. Again, this is the second event in the new Neurodiversity Speaker Series. You will see that link in the chat. In the meantime, please join me in a really warm virtual welcome for our friend Sam Drazin. Thank you, Sam.
Good evening, everybody. Oh my goodness, I love the love in the that I see here on the screen with the clapping and the hearts. What a great way to start my job on this what day is it? Tuesday evening. Thanks everyone for being here. It's gonna be a great workshop. As Charlene said, we will save time at the end for question and answer. So as I present this evening, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box, comments in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end of the evening. Give me one moment here. I am going to pull up the slides for this evening, and then we will get started. All right.
Perfect.
Great. So as Charlene said in her introduction, this is a presentation as part of the Neurodiversity Speaker Series. And tonight, we're really going to dig deep and challenge maybe our own misconceptions or ideas when it comes to the concepts of inclusion, ableism, and neurodiversity. My name, again, is Sam Drazin. I am a former elementary educator, a person who lives with a disability, and for the last 10 years, I've had the honor and the privilege to be a nationally recognized presenter, working at schools, organizations, supporting teachers, parents, administrators, and students in this inclusion journey that we are on. I've put my email address up here in the screen. It's also going to be dropped in the chat. I really hope that this isn't the end of my relationship with all of you, but rather just the beginning. So if there's something I said tonight that you want to explore further, if you'd like to chat offline about your particular situation, please don't hesitate to reach out to me via email. I now serve as the founder and executive director of a 501c3 nonprofit organization called Changing Perspectives. We work primarily with schools and districts to support their work in the area of social emotional learning and inclusion, really through the lens of students with disabilities. We do our work by offering schools access to curriculum resources, professional development trainings, family workshops as well. I invite and encourage you to follow us on social media, as well as visit our website for more information. With that being said, we're going to dive right in here. So as I mentioned, we've got a jam-packed agenda, a lot of things that we're going to tackle tonight, but hopefully you'll start to see the common thread that's weaved between all of them. We're going to start by really talking about what is inclusion. Inclusion in schools today is kind of a buzzword. People are talking about it a lot, but we don't often take the time to really unpack it, go deep and go, what does it actually mean? What does it mean to me? What does it mean to my child? What does it mean to my community? From that, we're going to migrate the conversation and talk about neurodiversity. After that, we're going to string those two together by really investigating what is ableism? How does an ableistic mindset, ableistic thinking influence inclusion and inclusionary practices, but also how can ableism perpetuate exclusionary practices? And lastly, we'll bring it all together by really talking about intersectionality. How do we really think about ourselves as people made up of multiple components of identity? And how can we ensure that our students feel loud and proud about who they are in the communities for which they live, play, and learn? So the first part of tonight's presentation, we're really going to jump in and investigate this idea of inclusion. I want to start with one of my favorite quotes by Verna Myers, and it reads, "Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance." I'm going to read that again. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. What I'd like you to do is take a moment and think to yourself about a time that you were invited to, quote unquote, the party. It doesn't need to be a literal party. It could be an event at your child's school. It could be a work event, etc. But I want you to think about a time that you attended some sort of function or event, gathering with other people, and you were there, but you didn't really feel like you belonged. Now I want you to think about a time that you were asked to dance. A time again that you went to a function of sorts, a gathering of people, and you felt like you belonged. You felt like you were heard, you were seen, you were a valued member of that gathering. And I think that's this distinction we got to be really mindful of. Sometimes schools will gather everybody in a classroom or an assembly and say, inclusion. We're physically all here in the same room. And I would say, I don't know if that's inclusion. That's diversity. That's being invited to the party. Where are those moments where we're being asked to dance? Because that's the true, authentic inclusion that we're really looking to cultivate. Inclusion is everywhere. And again, I stress this because a lot of times when I work with schools, we're looking at inclusion, but from a very singular perspective, like inclusion just in a classroom or inclusion just on an inclusive playground. Real, true, authentic inclusion happens in all of the places and spaces that make up the school sites that our children attend. So I really encourage you, if we have parents or caregivers on this call who have students with differing abilities, when you're in those IEP meetings, when you're in those 504 meetings, really ask those questions about not just inclusion happening, let's say in the classroom, but how is inclusion happening in all of the other places and spaces that our students are learning, playing, and navigating through on a daily basis. Another key component around inclusion is that we have to shift our mindset that difference is not a deficit. We tend to, and we'll talk more about this later on when we talk about ableism, but we tend to see individuals with differences as less than individuals without. And to create a truly inclusive experience for all, a place where everyone is being asked to dance, we have to make sure that we're not viewing one marginalized group as better or worse than another. Difference is not a deficit. So with some of those preliminary kind of mindset pieces, I want to now talk a little bit more specifically about what is inclusion. So like I said during the agenda, inclusion is a buzzword. People are talking about it. We are living through the DEI, DEIB movement right now. And inclusion is thrown around willy-nilly. And very rarely do we sit down like we're going to do tonight and say, what does inclusion mean for you? What does inclusion mean for me? Oftentimes in schools, what I notice is that everybody who works at that school has a different definition of what inclusion or inclusive practices are or should be. And so if we're all working together to create an inclusive environment for our students, it's really, really hard to do that if every adult that's supporting inclusion has a different vision or definition or understanding of what that should be. So here's one model that I like to share to really break inclusion down into three very, very distinct and kind of digestible pieces. So the first part here, number one in the green, is academic inclusion. With academic inclusion, we're really thinking about how are all students included in the academic experience through access to the content, the ability to participate in the learning experience, and the ability to demonstrate their knowledge in various ways. So academic inclusion really looks at the experience that students are having academically in terms of, can they access the content that's being delivered? Do they have voice and the ability to participate? And lastly, are they able to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that works or is inclusive of them? So that's the first bucket. The middle bucket, blue, number 2, physical inclusion. Obviously, we're talking about ramps, elevators, the ability for our students to physically access all of the places and spaces in the school, but it's also more than that. We know that many individuals who are neurodiverse may get triggered by certain senses, sensory overload. And so physical inclusion asks us to really think proactively about what are the senses in a specific place or space that could be triggering for a certain student, which then creates that place exclusionary. And so things like providing noise canceling headphones, fidgets, being mindful of the lighting, being mindful of the sound of the chair scraping on the tile floors in the classroom. All of that is what we're thinking about within physical inclusion. We're also thinking about the design of the places and spaces. Do classrooms have places where students can work in a small group? Do classrooms also have places where students can work individually? Do classes also have spaces where students can have a chill corner or a calm down corner to de-escalate if they need to? So academic inclusion, physical inclusion, and then lastly, and kind of the least tangible type of inclusion is what we call social inclusion. So social inclusion is, do students feel that they belong in that school? Social inclusion is, do all students see difference as a positive? Do they value diversity? Have they had an opportunity to understand others? Have students explicitly been taught how to play in an inclusive way? Oftentimes, adults say things and assume that students know what those things mean and that they're going to demonstrate it immediately. That's not realistic, right? Saying to students, make sure when you're out at recess, you include everyone. For some students, they don't know what that means. They don't know what that looks like, sounds like, or feels like. So we need to explicitly teach that. So to recap, inclusion is being asked to dance, not just invited to the party. And we can think about inclusion in these 3 distinct areas: academic inclusion, access, participation, and demonstration; physical inclusion, access to places and spaces, and being mindful and proactive around sensory triggers; and social inclusion, belonging, voice, value, and being explicitly taught on what inclusive play is. I encourage you to drop thoughts, comments in the chat, but also remember that there is a Q&A box. We will have time at the end of the presentation for question and answer. So make sure you drop any questions that you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. All right, so we've already accomplished step 1 of tonight's workshop, where we investigated and unpacked inclusion. Now what we're going to talk about is neurodiversity, another buzzword. You might hear it as neurodiversity, neurodiverse, neurodivergent. So what does this actually mean? When we think about disabilities and differences, we can unpack disability into 2 categories: invisible disabilities as well as visible disabilities. Invisible disabilities are going to be our individuals who are neurodiverse. There are those differences that are not obvious when you look at someone at first glance. Oftentimes, it could be harder for teachers and for a neurodiverse student's peers to empathize with them because their behavior or their communication may be a little bit different than what someone expects by looking at them. Like any disability or difference, there is a spectrum, there is a range. Like my friend and disability advocate, Emily Ladow, says, if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. Oftentimes, it takes time and patience to fully understand and realize the strengths as well as the needs of an individual who is neurodivergent. And we have to really think about being creative with our accommodation. It isn't just making sure there's closed captioning. It isn't just making sure there's a ramp, right? We have to really be mindful of what the different ways are that we can accommodate. Now, on the other side, I have visible differences. These are going to be the disabilities that are obvious at first glance, so might not necessarily be someone who is neurodivergent, maybe someone who lives with cerebral palsy or has another physical challenge. And they're often obvious at first glance. Now, as a result of them being obvious at first glance, it may be easy to create an accommodation. We're going to get to this when we talk about ableism, and I say may because if you're someone who does not live with that disability, you may make an assumption about what accommodation someone else needs because of how they look or how they're moving. Visible disabilities you could be born with or acquire later in life. So for some people, they've learned how to adapt a certain way their whole lives. For other people, they're readapting or relearning how to do something as a result of an illness, an accident, etc. And the last one says identity may be defined by disability. Oftentimes, the visible disabilities, we forget that someone has other components of their identity beyond just their disability. And we make an assumption that the only thing that that person is their disability. So neurodiversity is really more typically in the invisible disabilities category. And as a result, there's some things we really need to consider and be mindful of. If we take the word neurodiversity, we split it in half. It is neuro, our brain, diversity, what we think of when we think about diversity, a large group of different people gathered together. Neurodiversity is how everyone's brain is wired differently. That's it. That's as simple as it gets, folks. It is how our brains are diverse. No one brain in the world is identical. We all think a little bit differently. We all react to situations a little bit differently. Neurodiverse individuals are just people whose brains are wired even more differently. So I want to share with you now a short video that unpacks neurodiversity even further. What I like about this video is that what they do is they compare our brains to our fingerprints, which I think is a great sort of visual to help folks, adults and students alike, better understand this concept of neurodiversity.
Just like our fingerprints, all our brains are unique. But for the majority of people, their brains are similar enough that there are largely no obvious differences in how they function. They have differences in things like skills, preferences, and styles. But mostly, their brains mean they perceive the world in the same way. But for others, their brains are more fundamentally different. They have differences in things like social understanding, sensory processing, communication, and information processing. These differences are a result of neurological differences such as autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and more. This natural variation in our brains is called neurodiversity. Those of us with no neurological conditions are neurotypical, and those of us with neurological conditions are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people think differently. Their unique perspectives and experiences mean they can often excel at creativity and innovation, have highly specialised skill sets, and an ability to hyperfocus. If embraced, this can be a huge advantage to organisations and society. However, the differences neurodivergent people experience can make life challenging. In order to thrive at work, they often need some simple accommodations. For example, a sensory calm environment to recharge in, or a routine with the same start and end times. Approximately 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent, so not only is embracing neurodiversity critical for a truly inclusive organisation, but it also presents organisations with a huge opportunity.
I think they do a really nice job in that video in just a couple minutes, really explaining what is neurodiversity and the value of embracing neurodiversity. So just like on a previous slide, we had difference is not a deficit. Neurodiverse is not a deficit. And I know I'm reiterating this, but it's a really important thing that we have to change our growth mindset. We're going to talk a lot more about it when we get to our next section about ableism. So what are specific labels that might classify someone as neurodiverse or neurodivergent? Well, these are a few. And I think there's a lot of controversy in the world around labeling. Do we label what someone has, their diagnosis, or do we not? And here's what I think. I think labels can be incredibly empowering if we present them to our students in a certain way. I think labels also have the ability to be incredibly disenfranchising to our students if we present them in a certain way. So I don't think it's about are labels good or are labels bad. I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we help our students understand their identity as a neurodiverse individual in a way that empowers them to feel confident, in a way that helps them to become their own best self-advocate, in a way that strengthens their own self-confidence and makes them feel loud and proud. So I really challenge you to think about if you're struggling with labeling, whether it's telling your student or your child about their difference or not. It's less about should we or shouldn't we, and more how should we to achieve certain goals, the goals of self-advocacy skills, self-confidence, and self-awareness. What are some of the traits of individuals who are neurodiverse? Well, these are a few. They're going to be very individualized based on the individual, right? As I said, one person with a disability is just one person. One person who's neurodiverse is just one person. But oftentimes, students who are neurodiverse may struggle with social challenges, communication struggles. They may have some repetitive behaviors. They may have heightened anxiety or trouble focusing. Sometimes they might have challenges with their fine motor skills as well. So we set the stage by talking about inclusion and sharing that quote, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. We then got a little more granular by talking about inclusion into 3 different buckets: academic, physical, and social. From there, we talked about what is this concept of neurodiversity, being how our brains are diverse, connecting them to our fingerprints, recognizing that neurodiverse is not a deficit. Ableism is a really important concept because ableism and ableistic thinking is what is going to influence and or drive our behavior as individuals, as well as our systems behavior to be inclusive, to celebrate neurodiversity, or to be exclusionary of neurodiversity and see it as a problem or a deficit. So I want to share a short video clip with you. It's very short. I don't know if anyone's seen the TV show Speechless. It was a sitcom on ABC a few years back. And in the story, it is about a family who has 3 children, and their son, JJ, lives with cerebral palsy. And Speechless, you might not know, was actually a really groundbreaking show in public media, mainstream media, because the character or the actor who plays JJ also lives with cerebral palsy in real life. And it was one of the first times that an actor or actress who lives with a disability in real life was playing a character who lives with that same disability. Now, I'm not going to share anything more, but I want you to, as you watch this short video, think about why I chose this as a way to illustrate this concept of ableism. And feel free to drop those ideas in the chat, see if your ideas are the same or different with the several hundred people we have here tonight.
Let's go to school, shall we? Where's the wheelchair ramp? A garbage ramp?
It's not just a garbage ramp.
No, it's a garbage and my son ramp. Okay, crash course in basic human dignity. Let's play a little game I like to call trash or person. Are you Dr. Miller? Trash? Are you a person?
You're a person, Dr. Miller.
Of course, I am.
Of course you're a person.
Oh, doctor.
If you haven't seen Speechless, highly recommend it if you're interested in kind of concepts around society and these topics that we're talking about tonight. So what is ableism? Ableism, at its root, is discrimination or social prejudice of individuals with disabilities. The root of ableism is when we view people with disabilities as needing fixing, or they are not equal to those without disability. So you know how I said earlier, I'm going to be really repetitive, that difference is not a deficit? Well, the reason I was really repetitive about that is because ableism is the opposite of that. Ableism is the mindset that difference is a deficit, and the only way it will no longer be a deficit is if we fix what is perceived as wrong or different with someone who lives with a disability. So ableism, discrimination, social prejudice of individuals with disabilities. Now, if you haven't learned this yet, I like to start with big ideas and then unpack them. Well, I want to unpack inclusion into 2 different types of ableism. There is unintentional ableism, and there is intentional ableism. And as I go through these, I encourage you to do 2 things. 1, self-reflect. Self-reflect on your own actions, mindsets, beliefs, attitudes when it comes to individuals with disabilities, and see if any of the examples I share maybe relate to you. We can't get better until we first self-reflect. In addition to self-reflecting on your own mindsets, actions, values, and behaviors, I really encourage you to reflect and think about experiences you've seen or heard that fall into these categories. So let's start with unintentional ableism. So one form of unintentional ableism would be helping someone with a disability without their permission. So this is the assumption that we make when we see someone with a disability, and if you don't live with that disability, you jump in to heroically help them in some capacity without their permission. And what you're saying to them is, as someone without that disability, I have to help you because you have a deficit. The R word, which I hate using, but I'll use it so we're all on the same page here, which would be the word retard or retarded, is used as jokes a lot. You hear it a lot in movies still. You hear it a lot with stand-up comics. You hear it a lot in music. So using the R word in those ways is unintentionally ableistic. The other piece, and this is getting a lot better, but lack of disability representation in the media. There has been a surge recently with movies like Coda that have really kind of made center stage. But there's been a surge in movies and in the media highlighting individuals with disabilities. But in the past, that hasn't been the case. When I consult and work with schools, I challenge them to look at their school website, their school social media pages. Are their students with disabilities at their school featured on those pages? Usually they're not. When I walk through a school and I look at all the posters along the hallway, the posters that are like, hang in there, be a star, all those motivational posters, oftentimes those don't spotlight students with disabilities. So there is still a lot of unintentional ableism when it comes to that. Now, on the other side, we're talking about intentional ableism. So obviously, intentionally making fun of individuals with disabilities is intentional ableism. Forced integration and or segregation. So what do I mean by that? So obviously, let's force segregation. That's easy, right? If you have a disability, we're going to put you in this classroom for the whole day. And if you don't have a disability, we're going to put you over here. But what is forced integration? Forced integration is when we provide opportunities for students with and without disabilities to do something together, but we do it in such a way that it breeds sympathy from the student without the disability onto the student with, rather than empathy. Lastly, requirements that may exclude those with disabilities. Perfect example for this is when I work with schools and students who are in a special day classroom or a classroom for students with extensive support needs join their general education peers in gym. But the actual gym activity, the PE activity, isn't accessible, isn't inclusive of those students with more significant disabilities. So those students are now just sitting on the bleachers watching the rest of their gen ed peers participate. So that's an example of how sometimes we intentionally cultivate or perpetuate ableism by providing a place or a space, but not thinking through if it's fully inclusive to all that are going to be attending. Another way you can think about this is what's called the medical versus social model of disability. Let's start by talking about the medical model of disability. And I think this is really helpful because it helps us realize where our mindsets are, but it can also help us to put language to and theory to where other people's mindsets are. So the medical model of disability is just like the medical model if you're sick, right? So if you're sick, you go to a doctor or you go to the hospital. What do? They diagnose you with something, and then they give you medicine or they prescribe or they do a surgery or whatever to make you fixed, to feel better. So you no longer have the thing that's causing you pain or harm or whatever. The medical model of disability is the same idea. It's when we view disability as a deficit, as something that is wrong. When we view disability in that way, it instills for the person who lives with the disability a sense of shame, pity, embarrassment, etc. The medical model is focused on the concept of fixing. How do we fix X, Y, or Z person? It is really focused on this idea of what are the cures or what are the treatments. And when we approach it in that way, what we're saying is that the individual with the disability is a problem for our system, is a problem for our society, is a problem for our schools. So the medical model really focuses on fixing the individual so that they can better fit in to an existing structure. Very ableistic. The social model of disability is the opposite. The social model says, no. let's start by looking at our society and how do we change our systems and our society to be more inherently inclusive and accessible to all, neurodiverse and neurotypical alike. What it does is it first steps back and says, okay, let's consider what are the limitations that we're putting on people with disabilities, whether that's in our society or in an individual school or an organization, and recognizing how we can make those social barriers less obstructive so that we can better include all. So again, this is a really good model if you're struggling with like understanding this idea of ableism, because you can kind of use this model and go, okay, I kind of understand it. And it's really about a growth mindset. Mindset is going to lead to action. We can't have action. We can't change our schools to be more inclusive and understanding of all if we are stuck in a medical model perspective. We can't change our action if we still view disability as a deficit. We can't change our action if we're coming at it through an ableistic mindset. Wow. We've talked a lot about a lot of things today. Again, throw comments, aha moments. I love hearing when I do presentations, like, what was your aha moment? I'd love to see that in the chat. And in a few moments, we're going to switch over to Q&A. So now is a perfect time, if you haven't typed your question in the Q&A box, to type it in there so we can address it. We talked about inclusion. We talked about neurodiversity. We just left off with ableism. How do these things kind of fit together in this concept around intersectionality? So as I mentioned earlier, we're living through what we're calling the DEI movement, or now they're adding a B to it for belonging. People throw out DEI, DEI, DEI all the time. But what does it actually mean? Because diversity, equity, and inclusion are three very, very different buckets. And each bucket has different mindsets, and each bucket has different actions. So let's talk about this. The blue bucket, diversity. Diversity is being invited to the party, right? So what is it? It's the presence of differences. They may include, but are not limited to, race, gender, religious, sexual orientation, ability, and/or disability. It is the presence of differences. Let's jump to the orange bucket, equity. Equity is promoting justice, impartiality, fairness within certain procedures, systems, or processes. All right. So diversity is lots of different people together in a place, a shared space, a shared community. Equity is we're going to promote justice. We're going to promote inclusion. What is inclusion? Inclusion is the outcome. Inclusion is the action. So when folks say they're doing DEI, I really challenge us to kind of push a little bit, dig a little deeper, or as I like to say, unpack it a little bit more, right? What does diversity actually mean in your community? What is equity and what is inclusion? Diversity is being invited to the party. Equity or diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, quote, cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. So as we continue to unpack this idea of identity, neurodiversity, acceptance, and inclusion, I want to share this other visual with you about how all of these things really connect. Intersectionality is what's pulling all of these pieces together. Tonight, we talked about inclusion. We talked about DEI. We talked about neurodiversity. We talked about ableism. Carrie Gray is an advocate, and she speaks very profoundly around the role that intersectionality has in our society today. So take a moment to listen to what Carrie says.
My name is Carrie Gray. Carrie Gray is a Black disabled woman. And There's power behind that. In the United States, 1 in 4 in the Black community have some type of disability, whether that's visible or invisible. Historically speaking, organizations and institutions have shown us that they want to identify with one thing and build power around that, build influence and access. And I get it, right? So this idea that you have disability rights, you have women's rights, you have LGBTQ rights, and those kind of different pockets are really building a strong narrative. But the thing that I find to be harmful is when we're not building in coalition. Because the reality is that you have people like myself who are Black, disabled, and women, and so many other things. And when you live at the intersections of all 3 of those, then you can't split your political and social dynamics between these different groups. It doesn't produce real results of freedom, and it doesn't produce real results of access to employment and other opportunities that you're looking for. I'll give one example on this. So the Black Lives Matter movement. When it was created in conjunction mostly with a lot of young folks. What was unique about this particular movement was the intersectional philosophy that was built upon. The folks getting up and saying, we are not just fighting for one narrative, but we are specifically fighting for folks who are on the margins. We are fighting for Black folks who are also LGBTQ, who are women, who are femme, who are trans, who are disabled. They named it. They saw like their people across the country and said, I'm fighting for all of you. Not just some of you, not just the ones that have traditionally gained power and access. And that gives me a lot of hope because no one wants to be left behind.
So I want to end you tonight with a visual that I like to call the identity puzzle. Earlier tonight, we talked about neurodiversity labels. And I mentioned that we can use labels in empowering ways. We can also use labels in disenfranchising ways. And I like to imagine that each one of us, as Carrie Gray explained in the previous video, are made up of what I call an identity puzzle. So our body is made up of puzzle pieces. And each piece of the puzzle is a component of our identity. So I am white, I am male, I am disabled, I am teacher, I am all these things. And none of us, neurotypical or neurodiverse, are just one thing. And so how do we help to educate ourselves and others around concepts like ableism, concepts like intersectionality, concepts around inclusion and inclusive practices that are really thinking and doing it through the mindset of a global, full identity puzzle perspective? So we're taking into consideration how an individual, ourselves, our kids, our grandkids, our students, etc., are multiple puzzle pieces, and those puzzle pieces are not stagnant. They're fluctuating. As we become loud and proud about a component of our identity, that one becomes bigger. As maybe some part of our identity kind of disappears, it becomes smaller. So with that, I want to thank you all so much for spending your evening with me and the Parent Venture. And before we open it up to questions, I want to just make sure that everyone is aware of the upcoming events as part of this neurodiversity speaker series. So I'm going to turn it back over to Charlene. That gives you another moment to pop your question in the Q&A box. She'll share a little bit about the upcoming events so you don't miss out, and then we'll jump into Q&A.
Thank you so much, Sam. You know, that was brilliant. And I think you'll be happy to hear that people were asking, does he talk to kids in schools? How can we get him to come to our school? Yes, Sam Drazin talks to students and educators across the country. And his organization, Changing Perspective, does do that. Some of the links are in the chat. We'll make sure that everyone who attended tonight hears more about Sam and his organization. As he mentioned, this is new neurodiversity series with our partners, CHC and Real2E and the Riley Project and ELA and Compass High School. We have a 5-part series. This is the second. So what you're seeing on the screen here are the upcoming events. with Dave Flink from Eye to Eye, Ellen Cookman, an attorney, learning disabilities consultant, and then Eric Enlick and Elizabeth Hamlet, who will be talking about college learning and disabilities. So please do join us. If you sign up for this, you'll be getting information about these upcoming events, but we're really proud of this series and want to have you all there. All right, Sam, as you can imagine, this audience is very educated about neurodiversity. So the questions are great. They are some of them complex, but let's just give it a whirl in the time that we have, okay? Several people asked about cultural differences. So here's the question. Different cultures have different attitudes and schema around neurodiversity. How do you approach this with the diverse schools and communities you serve? And do you have any tips for helping culturally diverse communities come together around neurodiversity and inclusion?
That's a really great question. I live in Northern California. I travel nationally all the time to schools, big schools, small schools, rural school, urban schools. And this question comes up a lot. Cultural backgrounds and different communities value neurodiversity in different ways. I recognize that I'm speaking as a white male in this world. And so my perspective and value system around neurodiversity may be different than others. I think the way that I really like to approach it with more diverse communities is to take a step back and really start with concepts around empathy. This concept around empathy, and oftentimes people think empathy is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think that's an incredibly actually abstract way of thinking about it. And so empathy really isn't about putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Empathy is feeling with another person. So you don't have to have had the exact same experience as someone else to have empathy for them. But what you have to do is think about a time where you had your own unique experience that elicited the same emotion that someone is having. And that's empathy. And so really thinking about, we don't just jump into neurodiversity in communities where there's going to be different cultural beliefs and understandings and value systems around it, but we're really going to build in a very intentional and scaffolded way, starting with kind of the foundational concepts around empathy.
All right, thank you for clarifying that, Sam. Here's another good question. What are your perspectives on using the term learner variability in relation to neurodiversity, inclusion, and ableism? Learner variability.
Oh, language is so tricky. Language is so tricky. I have a lot of schools that I work with that even question if they should say disability, if they should say learning disability versus learning differences. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. I think it's not, it is the words we use, but it's also how we use it in a way that uplifts a certain population and recognizes the intersectionalities of identity. So I think learner variability is a great way to kind of build upon this idea of neurodiversity, right? We all learn in varied ways, learner variability. But for some students, they may, as Carrie Grace said, they may want to feel like they can identify with one or more specific groups because there is power in that. So you may think about learner variability in kind of a very UDL, universal design for learning sense of building and cultivating inclusion and in concepts of community. But for some of our students, if they live with dyslexia, if they live with dyscalculia, if they live with another specific thing that really impacts their day-to-day life, they may also want that to be named as well. So it's a little bit of voice and choice.
Okay, fair enough. I know that for some students, finding out that they're living with autism is a very liberating thing. It just really depends upon the child and the family, I'm assuming, Sam.
Exactly. It's very case by case. There's no, when I do these trainings, whether it's with parents at schools, with teachers, administrators, there's no one answer. There's a lot of gray in this work. So what I feel like I can do is I can give a lot of food for thought, but ultimately you need to digest that and think about what you're comfortable with, what is going to work for your community.
Okay. Here's a great question. If we could answer this one, Sam. How can we convince schools, programs, et cetera, that people with extensive support needs also benefit from authentic inclusion?
One of the things that I like to do when I work with schools around inclusion is I ask them 2 questions. I go in and I first start by asking the staff, what percentage of the teachers at the school view all students as their students?
Mm.
And what percentage of our students view all adults in the school building as their teachers? And those are really pivotal questions when we're starting this work. And you would be surprised how low those percentages are in some schools. And so when we think about this work, we have to really think about starting with the mindset. We've got to shift mindset so teachers view all students as their students, whether they see those kids 6 hours a day, 5 minutes a day, 3 minutes a week. It doesn't matter. If you are an adult in that building, every student should be your student, and every teacher should be, or excuse me, every student should be able to see every teacher as their teacher. So that's like one of the really big, oh, I love all the love. People love this one. That's a really important starting place. Another starting place is that we have to change some mindsets to recognize that inclusion supports students with extensive support needs, but it also supports our general education students. And sometimes there's fear one way or another that, oh, students with extensive support needs, if they're more included, that's going to take away from the learning from the gen ed students, or it's going to make it more a bait for teasing. And those are fear-based misconceptions. And when we have those fear-based misconceptions, it puts an immediate wall up, a fixed mindset wall that then we have to start taking down. So if we can move away from putting the wall up and start to lay the foundation of mindset, that's where we start to overcome these challenges.
Thank you, Sam. Really, really well said. Here's a related question, and I think this is on many people's minds. What is an effective way to help neurotypicals, those who don't have neurodivergent kids, to care more about inclusivity? I've heard you say that an inclusive classroom is good for all children.
Definitely. So if we think about the world today, right? In today's world, you don't necessarily need to be book smart to be successful. I remember, I won't date myself, but I remember when I was a kid growing up, in our living room, we had these big bookshelves, right? And we had the Encyclopedia Britannicas. And if you needed information, I had to go and I had to flip through. Today's world, we can find everything we need right here on our phones. What are the skills that we need to be? What are the skills that our students need to have to be successful in a 21st century global marketplace? It is communication. It is collaboration. It is teamwork. It is problem solving. It is perspective taking. It is connections. When we bring neurodiverse and neurotypical students together, that's when we create a natural playground for students to practice those skills. It's really hard to practice skills around multiple ways of communication if you're only around people who communicate the same way. And so there are benefits to both sides of the coin here.
All right. The questions are also good. This one is one that we are hearing a few times, Sam, and I'd like you to comment. What about disruptive behaviors in ADHD kids? How do we include them in a way that's helpful for the kid who may feel like he is just a troubled child or a bad kid?
This happens a lot. And then sometimes what happens is our students are self-segregating. So oftentimes individual students who are disrupting behavior, well, let me back up and say, we know all behavior is communication, right? So every behavior a child does is then communicating an unmet need. Now, the challenge on the adults is to figure out what's the unmet need. Oftentimes, students with attention deficit disorder goes back to the bucket I talked about earlier, physical inclusion, sensory overload, right? The way we design our classrooms by not providing flexible seating. Sometimes students are up and down. So how can we provide flexible seating? How can we provide fidgets? Really being attuned to what is the disruptive behavior. Is it fine motor skill challenges, so they need a fidget, or is it gross motor skills challenges where they need a resistance band on the length of their chairs? Is it that they're seated in the front of the class and their attention, they keep looking behind them to see what's happening? Well, maybe we need to move them to the back of the class. Is it that every little noise distracts them? Do they need to have some noise canceling headphones? So this happens a lot. And then oftentimes it's kind of ableistic. We're saying, because you're doing X behavior, now we're asking you to leave the classroom. Rather than looking at it from a social lens of disability and going, what's going on in the classroom that is triggering X, Y, or Z student to have this behavior that is then being viewed as disruptive? And how can we remove that trigger or put in place something to minimize that sensory input?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Because that is such a painful question for many parents, right? They understand their child, and then all of a sudden you're seeing exclusion. It's very hurtful. All right. We have really come to the end of our hour, Sam Drazin, but I have one final question for you, other than just letting everybody know that, yes, this event has been incredible. It is recorded, will be available soon on our video library for free. All registrants will get a copy of it. We've also had lots of requests for the links that have been shared in the chat. Thank you to the experts who've also given links. We have our own set. Sam Drazin has also provided some links, so we will do our best to assemble those. Really good question. All right, Sam. From everything that you have seen and experienced, because tonight has been, look at all those clapping here.
Oh my gosh, I love it. I'm clapping back. I'm clapping back.
Really great. This has been a difficult topic, but what gives you hope?
That's a good question. I was not prepared for that one. I feel like that one was out of left field, Charlene. What gives me hope in this work is, first of all, the fact that we are talking about it. Conversations around these topics are more prevalent now than ever before, and that's where it starts. Conversations lead to mindset shift. Mindset shift leads to actionable change. Another thing that gives me hope is that when I go to schools and I meet with students and I talk directly to students and I hear what they're sharing, and I go out on the playground or in the cafeteria or in the classroom and I observe, and what I notice is that students are naturally empathetic. They are naturally curious individuals. The problem is that our systems are putting up barriers for them to show that natural curiosity and that natural empathy in a way that fosters and strengthens inclusive practices. So it's really the kids today that I get to interact with, the passionate teachers that I get to meet with, the passionate parents. That's what inspires me every day to get up and do this work 12, 13, 14 hours a day.
Well, Sam, that question may have been a surprise, but you did a beautiful job answering it. So listen, you'll see the comments in the chat. People are so grateful. This is really, we've set a new record here for hearts, I think. We really want to thank you, Sam Drazin from Changing Perspectives, for a truly brilliant conversation tonight. Everybody, please join us for the next event. Thank you to all of our partners and our sponsors. Take care, everybody, and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Sam. Good night, everybody.
For having me. Good night. Thank you all.